What if I told you that Blake Lively's entire legal strategy may have just blown up in her face? Not only are her retaliation claims starting to crumble, but court filings reveal something even more shocking. Her own team got caught using a secret audio recording, the very thing they accused others of doing illegally. This twist has Hollywood buzzing, the judge circling, and Blake scrambling to explain how it all went so wrong. Stay with me because what we're about to uncover changes everything. Blake Lively's legal team has been moving in ways that no one expected, and now everything is unraveling in a way that feels almost surreal. Because for months they have been trying to paint themselves as the victims, as the ones under attack. And yet here, we are staring at a revelation that flips the entire story upside down. And it begins with secret audio. The very thing they accused me of. They swore I was the one who had crossed the line. They threw allegations of criminality at me, trying to claim I had secretly recorded conversations, when in reality I was crystal clear. I was on a recorded line. I asked for on-the-record comment. I was open, I was transparent, I made it clear, and yet they wanted to weaponize that and twist it into something sinister. But here is the shocking twist. It turns out Blake Lively and her team have been caught using their own secret audio recordings, and suddenly the entire mask begins to slip because what they accused me of, they were actually doing themselves. Imagine the hypocrisy of building your case on claims of being wronged when you yourself are engaging in the exact same tactic, but trying to hide it from the court, from the public, from everyone who has been following this saga. And the moment this revelation hit the docket, I knew it was something we had to dissect piece by piece, because it changes the energy of the entire case, and it exposes something far deeper about the strategy at play here. It is not about justice. It is not about truth. It is about control and manipulation. And this new filing lays it bare because Wayfarer has now stepped forward, demanding that the entire audio recording be unsealed, that the world hear it all, not just the cherry-picked lines that Blake and her lawyers pulled out to frame the narrative they wanted everyone to believe. And when you read the court response, you realize how bold it really is. Blake tried to quote selectively from this secret recording while also attempting to keep the full tape sealed from public view. Her filing even admitted that she had placed the relevant substance in the public record, but conveniently ignored that the man on the recording, Steve Sowitz, was never told, never consented to being taped. Wayfarer is calling her bluff, saying, no, if you are going to put this audio into play, if you are going to use it against us, then the full truth must come out. Not just the pieces you find useful, release it all. Let the world hear the full context, and you can feel the power of that demand, because it cuts directly through the tactics of misdirection and spin for too long. This case has felt like it was being staged with carefully chosen fragments of information, a performance designed to sway perception while burying inconvenient context. But that all crumbles the moment the full audio is heard, because then it is no longer her interpretation. It is no longer her cherry-picked transcription. It is the raw truth. And that is why this moment is so dangerous for her, because if the court orders it unsealed, then suddenly the entire story she has been trying to sell may collapse under the weight of what was really said and done. And this is where the suspense builds, because the court filings reveal that Blake is desperate to keep it hidden. Her team argued that unsealing would only fuel more media coverage that would harm her reputation. They even tried to say that the privacy interests were hers, when in fact the privacy belongs to the man secretly recorded without consent. And that is the point. Wayfarer drove home. It is not Blake who was wronged here. It is Steve Sowitz, and he wants the full truth revealed. And that contrast is striking because it shows that Blake is not trying to protect anyone else. She is trying to protect herself, her image, her carefully curated narrative. And it raises the uncomfortable question of why she would want context buried if the context truly supported her claims. If she really believed this recording was proof of abuse or misconduct, then why not let the entire tape speak for itself? Why insist on sealing it? Why cling to selective quotes? And that question lingers like a storm cloud, because it suggests the full audio may not actually help her case. It may even weaken it. And that is why this entire chapter feels like such a turning point. Not just legally, but publicly, because the pattern is now undeniable. Time and again, she has accused others of wrongdoing, only to be caught engaging in similar tactics time and again. She has shifted her claims, her timelines, her stories. When one angle does not stick, she pivots to another. And that is where the retaliation claims come into play. because just as the audio revelation is shaking things loose, we are now watching her entire narrative around retaliation begin to shift in ways that raise even more doubts. And the filings show that in her latest argument, she is moving the timeline again suddenly, alleging that the smear campaign began during filming itself, a bold new claim, because previously she had insisted the second phase of filming was smooth, free of problems, even stating it herself in earlier documents. So why now the sudden shift? Why now claim retaliation during a period she once admitted was uneventful? The answer seems clear. It is a legal tactic, a desperate attempt to close the causation gap that has plagued her case from the beginning, because courts want retaliation to follow closely after the alleged protected activity. But in her own filings, she left an 8-month gap between when she supposedly raised complaints in January 2024 and when she claims retaliation began in August 2024. 8 months of silence. 8 months where nothing happened. That gap is fatal to her case. So what does she do? She moves the goalpost, and now suddenly the retaliation supposedly began earlier during filming in late 2023 or early 2024. But the problem is that directly contradicts her own prior admissions, and it looks like a pivot, not the truth, and when you step back, the larger picture becomes clear. Her entire case seems to rest on shifting sands, always adjusting, always rewriting, always reframing to fit the moment. And that is why I believe this entire strategy is destined to collapse, because truth does not require constant revision. Only stories built on weak foundations do. And as I watch this play out, it is not just frustrating, it is revealing, because it shows exactly how far her team is willing to go to preserve the illusion of being wronged, even if it means accusing others of crimes they themselves are secretly committing, even if it means moving timelines and inventing retaliation where none was ever documented. It reveals a desperation that cannot be hidden forever, and the cracks are already showing for those of us who have followed this case closely. None of this is surprising. But for the wider public, this revelation about the secret audio may be the moment that finally shifts perception, because hypocrisy this blatant is hard to ignore, and the more the court record exposes it, the harder it becomes for her to spin it away. And that is why I say this case is spiraling, because the walls are closing in piece by piece. Every tactic that once seemed like a clever maneuver is now backfiring, because the truth has a way of cutting through the noise. And when the full audio comes out, when the timeline contradictions are laid bare, it will be impossible to maintain the story she has been telling. And that is why I believe we are witnessing the beginning of the end for these claims, because the evidence is no longer bending to her narrative. Her narrative is bending under the weight of the evidence. And that is a suspenseful place for us to be, because we do not yet know exactly what the audio will reveal. We do not yet know how the judge will rule on the sealing motion. But what we do know is that cracks are spreading faster than they can be patched. And once the flood breaks, there will be no stopping the truth from spilling out. The deeper I go into this case, the more I realize how much of it is built on shifting narratives and legal theatrics designed to confuse and overwhelm rather than clarify. And the clearest sign of that is how the retaliation claims have been stretched, pulled, reshaped over and over as though they were clay, being molded to fit whatever angle might work best in that moment. But clay eventually cracks when it is overworked, and that is exactly what is happening here. Because if you remember at the start, the entire argument was that she endured harassment during the making of the film, and that afterwards she suffered retaliation. But the filings now show her team is retroactively pushing the start of the retaliation further and further back. And this is important because causation matters. Courts want to see a direct line between a protected activity and an adverse action. And when the timeline has an 8-month gap as hers did, it becomes nearly impossible to argue retaliation with a straight face. So now she is dragging the start point back into the middle of filming, hoping to blur that gap. But in doing so, she contradicts her own earlier statements, where she admitted the second round of filming was problem-free, smooth without incident. And that contradiction is devastating because it forces the question of what the truth actually is. If she was fine, then how can she now claim retaliation occurred at the same time? And if retaliation did occur, why was it never mentioned? Before, why was it not part of her initial filings? Why does it only surface now conveniently, when the gap becomes a legal problem? And once you see that pattern, you cannot unsee it. Because the same thing happened with the audio. First, she condemned me for recording, insisting that it was criminal conduct. Then the filings reveal she herself is relying on secret recordings without consent. trying to bury the context and only reveal the parts that suit her narrative. The hypocrisy is staggering, and it paints a portrait not of a victim seeking justice, but of a strategist grasping at any tool, any tactic to keep her case alive regardless of consistency. And the courts notice that judges are not blind to shifting narratives. They know when someone is moving the goalpost to preserve a weak position. And that is why I believe her retaliation claims will eventually fall apart, just as her credibility already has in the public eye, because audiences are not blind either. They see the contradictions, they see the pivots, and every pivot chips away at trust. Now imagine being a juror in this situation, being asked to follow a story that keeps changing, dates keep shifting, evidence appears in fragments, and context is hidden behind sealed filings. At some point, you would have to ask yourself, why is this case being presented in such a fragmented and contradictory way? And the answer is clear. It is because the full picture does not align with the story being told. And when that becomes obvious, the entire case crumbles. And that is why the defense has leaned so heavily into demanding transparency, insisting on unsealing the recordings, pushing back on vague allegations, because they know sunlight is the enemy of manipulation. And the more light shines on these tactics, the weaker her case becomes. And it is telling that the filings themselves, note her reasoning for sealing, is that unsealing would generate media coverage harmful to her reputation. Think about that. She is admitting she fears how the public will react if they hear the full audio that is not the reasoning of someone confident in the strength of their evidence, that is the reasoning of someone who knows the evidence may damage them and is scrambling to contain it. And that desperation seeps through in every filing, every attempt to reframe the timeline, every effort to deflect blame onto others. And it raises the bigger question of how long this can continue, because litigation is slow, but it is relentless. Filings build momentum, contradictions stack up, and eventually the weight of all those inconsistencies cannot be ignored. This is why I have said from the start that I do not see her and Ryan winning this case, because even if they manage to drag it out, the underlying weaknesses will only grow clearer over time. The longer this goes, the more contradictions emerge and the more the public becomes aware of them. And that is a dangerous game, because reputation once lost is not easily regained, and Hollywood is watching, studios are watching, actors are watching. And every revelation that exposes manipulation or hypocrisy makes it harder for others to publicly stand beside them. The narrative that once painted them as victims now risks painting them as aggressors, as manipulators, and once that shift takes hold, it is nearly impossible to reverse. And that is why these new filings feel so critical, because they expose in plain language the cracks in her story. They show the court openly acknowledging that she is selectively quoting recordings while trying to suppress the full truth. They highlight the absurdity of claiming reputational damage as a reason to seal evidence when it was her own choice to introduce selective quotes in the first place. And they underscore the contradictions in her retaliation timeline, forcing everyone to question whether there was ever any consistency to begin with. The suspense now lies in what happens when the judge rules on the motion to unseal if the audio is released. It could be the breaking point, because the public will no longer be relying on snippets. They will hear the full context, and context is everything without it. She has been able to craft a narrative, but with it, that narrative may collapse entirely. And that is why you can feel the tension building on both sides. Wayfarer pushing for full transparency, Blake fighting to keep things sealed, and everyone else waiting to see what the truth actually sounds like. And I believe when that moment comes, it will not only change the course of the case, it will change public perception forever. Because there is a difference between believing a story and hearing the raw, unedited reality. And once people hear that, there is no going back. As this legal storm deepens, I find myself circling back to the same haunting question. What was the end game here? What did Blake Lively and her team truly hope to accomplish? By weaponizing fragments of recordings, by reshaping timelines, by casting accusations onto anyone who dared to question their narrative, because when you step back from the filings and the drama and the endless back and forth, the pattern becomes painfully clear. It is about control of the story, control of the headlines, control of the perception of who is the villain and who is the victim. And yet the irony is that the harder they try to control the narrative, the more uncontrollable it becomes, because truth has a way of clawing its way to the surface, no matter how deeply it is buried. And right now, the truth is scratching loudly at the surface, threatening to break through at any moment, and you can see the panic in the filings. The desperate push to seal the audio, the sudden shifts in when retaliation, supposedly began the insistence on reputational harm being the real danger instead of any actual violation. And it paints a picture, not of a strong case, but of one fraying at the seams. And that fraying is accelerating because the contradictions are multiplying and each one makes the next easier to spot. For example, think of the retaliation timeline. She first said there were no problems during Phase 2 filming. Then, when the causation gap became clear, she changed it to say retaliation actually started then during filming, but that directly contradicted her earlier admission that things were smooth. So then the explanation becomes fuzzy, vague. Suddenly she cannot clearly define what protected activity triggered retaliation or even what the retaliation looked like, because her own filings have admitted that nothing happened on set. So then what is she pointing to? What is she alleging? And that lack of clarity is not just a weakness. It is a fatal flaw, because courts want specificity. They want to see a line drawn from action to reaction. And here there is no line, only scattered dots being rearranged to look like one. But when you connect them honestly, the picture falls apart, and it mirrors the audio situation perfectly. Because there too, she is trying to rearrange fragments to tell a story while burying the full picture. And when you realize it is the same tactic playing out in two different arenas, you begin to see the larger strategy at work. It is not about proving anything, it is about spinning just enough of a story to survive the moment, to push the case a little further, to keep control a little longer. But that strategy is unsustainable because eventually the fragments collide with the full record, and the contradictions cannot be ignored forever. And that is why the filings from Wayfarer are so sharp. They cut directly to that weakness by saying, fine, if you want to use the recording, then unseal it. If you want to allege retaliation, then specify. When and how, do not hide behind vague statements, do not cherry pick. And suddenly her strategy is being cornered, because those demands for clarity are demands she cannot meet without undermining her own narrative. And that is why I say the suspense. Here is not whether cracks will show, but when they will widen into full collapse, because it feels inevitable at this point. And yet the human part of me cannot ignore the frustration of watching how long this has already dragged on. How many people have been pulled into it? How many reputations have been smeared along the way? Justin Baldoni has been dragged through the mud. Content creators, myself included, have been attacked with baseless accusations. Even her own colleagues have been placed under suspicion, all because a narrative had to be maintained. And yet with each revelation, it becomes harder to believe in that narrative and easier to see the manipulation behind it. And that is why I keep returning to this case, because it is not just a legal battle. It is a cautionary tale about how far some will go to preserve an image and how dangerous that can be when the truth is treated as an obstacle instead of a foundation. And make no mistake, the truth is coming, because the pressure for transparency is not letting up. And once the full audio is heard, once the contradictions and the retaliation claims are laid bare, the image that has been so carefully maintained will no longer hold. And when that happens, the fallout will be immense, because reputations built on illusion collapse faster than anyone expects. And the public is not forgiving when they feel manipulated, when they realize they were fed a story instead of the truth. The backlash is swift and harsh, and Hollywood knows it too. Executives watch these filings and they see the contradictions, they see the hypocrisy, and they start to distance themselves quietly at first, then more openly. Because no one wants to attach themselves to a sinking ship. And that may be the most devastating consequence of all. Because in chasing control, she risks losing the very thing she sought to protect: her career, her standing, her influence, and all of it slipping. Not because of what others did, but because of the choices made in this case: the choice to secretly record, the choice to cherry pick, the choice to seal the context, the choice to shift the story again and again, each one a brick removed from the foundation, until the structure can no longer stand. The more I watch this unfold, the clearer it becomes that we are not just dealing with a lawsuit. We are witnessing the slow unraveling of a carefully constructed illusion. And it is unraveling because every move that was meant to strengthen the case ends up revealing its weaknesses even more starkly. And when you think about it, that is the ultimate irony, because secrecy was meant to protect her image. But secrecy is exactly what raised suspicions. Shifting timelines were meant to close legal gaps, but shifting timelines only exposed contradictions. Accusations meant to intimidate critics only highlighted the desperation behind the strategy. And now we stand at a point where every step forward feels like a step closer to collapse. Because when credibility is questioned in court, when credibility is questioned in public, there is little left to lean on. And that is where the danger lies for Blake Lively, because her entire case rests on people believing her story. But the more that story changes, the harder it becomes for anyone to believe. And that disbelief spreads quickly. It spreads through the legal system. It spreads through the industry. It spreads through the public. And once that trust is broken, it rarely returns. And as much as her team tries to spin and pivot, there is no escaping that reality. Because the filings speak louder than the press releases, the contradictions in her own words speak louder than any soundbite, and the secrecy around the audio recording speaks louder than any curated quote. And that is what makes this so dramatic and so suspenseful, because at any moment, the entire story could flip the moment the judge rules to unseal the audio, the moment the contradictions in her retaliation claims are fully scrutinized, the moment the public begins to realize how many pivots have been made to keep the case alive. Those are the moments that will turn this from a prolonged spectacle into a collapse. And you can almost feel it coming. The way pressure builds before a storm. The filings now read like a battle against inevitability, as though she knows the walls are closing in and yet insists on pushing them back with the same flawed tools that created the problem in the first place. And it is painful in a way, because had there been honesty from the start, had the truth been embraced instead of hidden, this entire ordeal might have been avoided. But that is not the path that was chosen. And now, we are left in a place where every revelation chips away at what remains of her credibility and the suspense for us. The observers is in watching how far it will go before it finally collapses. Will the audio be the moment? Will the contradictions in the retaliation timeline be the moment? Will a judge finally call out the inconsistencies in plain terms, whatever it is? It feels inevitable that something will give, and when it does, the fallout will not just be legal, it will be personal, it will be reputational. It will ripple outward through Hollywood, through the media, through the public perception that once held her in high regard. And that is what makes this story so gripping, because it is not just about legal filings, it is about the human cost of choosing. Illusion over truth, and we see that cost rising with every new development. At the end of the day, what makes this entire saga so extraordinary is not just the legal maneuvering, not just the public relations spin, and not even the constant stream of contradictions. What makes it extraordinary is the raw spectacle of watching a carefully curated Hollywood image collide head-on with reality. Every filing, every leak, every pivot has brought us closer to a moment of truth that cannot be avoided. And when that moment comes, whether it is the release of the audio, the exposure of contradictions in her own testimony, or the final word from a judge, the result will be devastating for those who built their defense on illusion rather than substance. This story has never been about just one lawsuit. It has become a reflection of how fragile reputations are when they are built on secrecy, how quickly credibility erodes when narratives shift, and how merciless both the legal system and the public can be when they sense that something is being hidden from them. The suspense is not in whether the truth will emerge. It is in how long the illusion can hold before the cracks become too wide to ignore. For Blake Lively, the stakes could not be higher. Her name, her career, her legacy, everything is on the line, and the choices made in these filings will determine whether she walks away vindicated or diminished.